Hi guys, first attempt here at a flipped lecture today looking at the beginning of World War II. Big idea or big question for us, how does appeasement affect conflicts around the world? Appeasement means essentially letting someone get away with something that they shouldn't. Some of the topics that we're going to cover here: Japan, China in the beginning of World War II in Asia, the rise of totalitarianism in Europe, and Hitler in the beginning of World War II in Europe as well. Kind of an overview, the 1930s and 1940s were challenging decades. A worldwide economic crisis, the Great Depression, led to a global war that became the most deadly and destructive conflict in human history. About 80 million people lost their lives during World War II, which involved industrialized genocide and nearly wiped out entire populations. By the end of the war, the United States emerged as the world's strongest superpower, boasting the strongest economy and looking forward to a prosperous, consumer-driven society. However, the war raised multiple questions and triggered new social forces that would confront future generations of Americans. Although the United States entered the war in 1941, 2 years after the conflict in Europe began in 1939, the events leading up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor started much earlier. For Japan, the war had begun a decade before the surprise attack on December 7th, 1941. Japan, which had long been a country based on military strength, saw an increase in democracy in the 1920s. More people were given the right to vote, the military was reduced, and political parties were allowed to form. However, as Japan faced the troubles of the Great Depression, support for democracy faltered, and the military reasserted its power within Japanese culture. Unlike the Soviet Union and Germany, Japan did not witness a single individual leader who took control of the nation. Rather, the military played a significant role in shaping Japanese foreign and domestic policy. The military argued that Japan should expand across Asia, imperializing new areas to gain access to natural resources and new markets, solving the economic problems of the 1930s Great Depression, and guaranteeing future security. A puppet emperor who held no real power was the head of the nation, and some within Japan argued that the country should collaborate with other Asian countries to get rid of imperialism in Asia. However, after political crises and assassinations heightened tensions, military factions within Japan overpowered the more moderate civilian government, committing the country to aggressive military expansion. A seemingly minor incident known as the September 18 incident by the Chinese and the Manchurian incident by the Japanese ignited a conflict that would last 13 years and result in the deaths of over 35 million people. Understanding Japan's motivations for attacking China and the brutal stalemate that followed is crucial for grasping Japan's unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor and consequently the United States' involvement in World War II. On September 18, 1931, a small explosion damaged railroad tracks owned by the Japanese-controlled South Manchuria Railway in Manchuria, China. The railway company claimed that Chinese protesters were responsible for the bombing. However, evidence suggests that this explosion was actually a planned act by the Japanese to justify an invasion of mainland China. Eager for Chinese territory and recognizing the disorganization of Chinese forces, the Japanese Imperial Army launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria under the false idea of protecting Japanese citizens and investments. The invasion was swift. Because China lacked a unified army, the Japanese defeated isolated warlords, and by February 1932, all of Manchuria was under Japanese control. Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek sought assistance from the League of Nations, the international peacekeeping body formed after World War I. The United States supported their efforts, refusing to recognize any state established through Japanese aggression. The League of Nations found Japan guilty of starting the Sino-Japanese War and demanded that Japan return Manchuria to China. In March 1933, Japan left the League of Nations. Isolated, Japan's radical military leaders gained power by highlighting military successes in Manchuria while criticizing the failures of the civilian government. The military assumed control of Japanese policy, believing that conquering China would fulfill Japan's industrial needs and establish dominance in East Asia. Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China on July 7, 1937, defeating the National Revolutionary Army led by Chiang Kai-shek. The Chinese army fell back, surrendering key cities. Beijing fell on August 8, Shanghai on November 26, and Nanking on December 13. The brutal siege and subsequent sacking of Nanking resulted in between 250,000 and 300,000 deaths and widespread sexual violence, later termed the Rape of Nanking. To counter the invasion, Chiang Kai shek adopted a scorched earth policy, retreating inland while destroying resources behind him. This approach hurt Japanese efforts but alienated many Chinese civilians and became a powerful propaganda tool for the Chinese Communist Party, which would later overthrow the Chinese nationalists after World War II. As Americans read about the brutal fighting in China, most Americans were unwilling to intervene. After the devastating losses of World War I, many Americans adopted an isolationist stance, opposing involvement in conflicts in Europe and Asia. Even those who wanted to help believed that the American military was inadequate. The Japanese army was a formidable or strong force with over 4 million soldiers and 900,000 Chinese collaborators equipped with modern weapons. By 1940, Japan's navy was among the most powerful in the world. In the face of widespread abuse, murder, and rape, Chinese nationalists sought aid from the United States. Although it's believed Japan's aggression ought to be punished, the United States did not take significant action during the 1930s. The invasion of China by the Japanese had interrupted an ongoing Chinese civil war. Amid the Japanese invasion, both the nationalists and the communists, who'd been fighting each other, pushed back on Japan, leading to a stalemate in China. However, while the nationalists regrouped to fight the foreign invaders, the communists built their fighting force from around 7,000 people to an army of 1.2 million armed peasants by the end of World War II. Although the Japanese invasion paused the Chinese Civil War, it did not end that conflict, and communism in China would become a central theme after World War II ended. This is kind of a look at Japan's territory that they held during World War II, specifically here in 1942, before the United States was pushing back on them. Going over to Europe, looking at the war in Europe. Meanwhile, in Europe, major powers were grappling with the aftermath of World War I as the global economic crisis, the Great Depression, plunged the continent into chaos. Understanding World War II in Europe is directly related to understanding World War I and the lives of Europeans during the 1920s and 1930s. While Wilson's 14 points after World War I encouraged countries to turn toward democracy, the economic despair of the worldwide Great Depression left people looking for strength in their national governments. Many of these countries turned to totalitarianism, a political system where the state holds total authority over society and seeks to control all aspects of public and private life. Throughout history, many countries have been ruled by one person, with these governments often being called monarchies or dictatorships. However, in a totalitarian nation, a dictator doesn't only control the government, but also every part of day-to-day life. People in totalitarian countries do not have the civil rights or civil liberties we think about them having in the United States. Freedom of speech and of the press are absent, as are all the other protections in the Bill of Rights. Russia, which had fought alongside the British and the French during World War I, faced a bloody communist revolution in 1917. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, Russia and its neighbors formed the Communist Soviet Union. Lenin's totalitarian leadership resulted in starvation, famine, and the deaths of millions of Russians. Following Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin took over the Soviet Union. Cruel, ruthless, and tyrannical, Stalin used his complete control over the government to assassinate political rivals, sentence innocent people to death, and form a state-run farm system that killed at least 10 million Soviet people. Anyone who opposed Stalin's rule was immediately sent to the Gulag, a system of forced labor camps. In a style that is typical of totalitarian leaders, Stalin used propaganda to maintain power and take credit for the success of the Soviet Union. Free speech against Stalin was censored. Advertisements glorifying his work were displayed everywhere, and only positive photos of Stalin were shared with the public, portraying their leader as a hero and father figure to the country. In Italy, Benito Mussolini took power. Italy had seen its economic system destroyed after World War I, and when unemployment rose and the United States limited immigration, peasants and laborers went on strike, leading to a complete breakdown of law and order under a very weak government. Unlike Soviet communism, which sought to control factories and businesses to help poor lower classes, Mussolini created a fascist government in Italy. Under fascism, businesses are encouraged, but all freedom of speech is removed. The government controls the media, brainwashes the youth into worship of the government leader, and maintains a secret police to enforce the will of the government. Although communism was eliminated in Italy, personal liberty was also destroyed, leading once again to a totalitarian regime. At the same time, Germany's government collapsed, giving rise to Adolf Hitler's National Socialist or Nazi Party. Promoting German racial superiority, fascism, and military expansion, Hitler rose to power, becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933 and getting rid of democratic institutions that checked the power of national leaders. He rejected the Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I. He rejected the penalties on Germany involved with that, rebuilt the military, even though that had been specifically outlawed. In 1936, he intervened in the Spanish Civil War alongside Benito Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, to help install Francisco Franco as yet another totalitarian leader in Europe. In his book Mein Kampf, Hitler called for the unification of German-speaking peoples and sought more German territory in Eastern Europe. Once in power, he pursued these goals. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria, or made it a part of Germany, and targeted a mostly German region, Czechoslovakia. Alarmed, Britain and France agreed, in an agreement called the Munich Pact, that Germany could annex the region or take control of it in exchange for a promise to stop further expansion. By allowing Germany to take over more land, Britain and France attempted to appease Hitler. Appeasement is when someone is allowed to do something they shouldn't do in order to maintain peace. However, Hitler's ambitions continued, and in March 1939, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia and made demands on Poland, proving to Britain and France that their attempts to appease him had not worked. Hitler signed a secret agreement with the Soviet Union, dividing Poland between them and promising an alliance to prevent war between the two countries. The European War officially began when Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France declared war 2 days later, mobilizing their forces. They hoped that Poland could hold out for several months, but it fell within just 3 weeks. The German army, eager to avoid a longer war like World War I, built a modern force focused on speed and maneuverability, employing the Blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy. After Poland's defeat, France and Britain braced for a German attack. Throughout the winter of 1939 and 1940, fighting was mostly limited to smaller fronts in Norway. In May 1940, however, Hitler launched an invasion of Western Europe, bypassing French defenses. Poland had fallen in 3 weeks, and France fell in just a few more. By June, Hitler was photographed in front of the Eiffel Tower as Germany controlled France. With France defeated, Hitler turned his attention to Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of the British Isles, required air superiority over the English Channel. From June to October, the German Air Force battled the Royal Air Force for control of the skies. Despite having fewer planes, British pilots won the Battle of Britain, preventing an immediate invasion and likely saving the British people from German domination. Although Britain avoided an invasion, it was not safe from further attacks. After failing in the Battle of Britain, Hitler initiated the Blitz, a bombing campaign targeting British cities. The German Air Force bombed London, Liverpool, and Manchester nightly from September to the following May, prompting families to send children into the countryside for safety. Those who remained took refuge in shelters, emerging to extinguish fires and bury the dead. The Blitz continued until June 1941, when Hitler chose to invade the Soviet Union. Seeking to acquire agricultural land and oil fields and eliminate the Soviet threat, Hitler broke his agreement with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union on June 22. It was the largest land invasion in history. Germany had swiftly conquered France and Poland, and officials hoped to defeat Russia before winter. The Blitzkrieg strategy initially worked as the German military captured vast territories and thousands of prisoners. However, the Soviet Union was gigantic, and its people were willing to make significant sacrifices, including dying in combat, to stop the Nazis' advance. After regrouping, Stalin relocated factories east of the Ural Mountains and ordered a scorched earth strategy, destroying resources as they retreated. The German army advanced, but became too thin to maintain the fighting while facing partisans in the harsh Russian winter. The German army suffered significant losses during the brutal war at Leningrad and at Stalingrad. Ultimately, it was the Soviet Union that broke Hitler's campaign, with 25 million Soviet soldiers and civilians losing their lives during the Great Patriotic War. Accounting for approximately 80% of all German casualties during World War II, the Russians killed 850,000 Germans at the Battle of Stalingrad alone. Going forward, we'll get into U.S. involvement in World War II, but that is the end of this first lesson.